Hi everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar, which is on the transition between 22301 2012 and the 2019, so business continuity management. My name is Henry Igo. I am a business development manager here at NQA. So I'm here today just very quickly to give you an overview of NQA and who we are. And then what I'll do is I will then be passing you over to Alan, who is our operational resilience professional, and obviously the main reason why you're here today. Next slide, please, Alan. So, as I said, obviously for you who are familiar with NQA, I'll keep this very brief. But what we are is, if you're not an existing client, we are a global organization who are owned by a large American company called NTS, who are the leaders in the testing and inspection industry. We have a large number of standards that we certify to. We've been around for over 30 years now. Globally, we employ over 1,000. And I think over the breakdown, that's just over 100 employees in the UK with 12,000 active certificates. We have an average partnership of over 10 years, which when you consider the certification cycle is 3 years, you can see that there is a high retention of clients there. This is also backed up by our Net Promoter Score, which is a metric calculating the likelihood that a customer would then recommend the company to a colleague or a friend. So the range of that is between -100 to +100. And the industry average is 43, and NQA currently sat at 72, which is the highest within industry. So our core standards in the UK being the big three, which are the 9001, 14 and 45001. However, given the recent pandemic, we have seen a large increase in 27001, which is information security. With more and more people working from home, obviously it has become on the forefront of leaders' minds. Also, again, the reason we're here today, 22301, so business continuity, which follows on nicely from the InfoSec and obviously reflects the pandemic over the past year. So as you can see the stats, in the US, we are in the #1 certification body in the aerospace sector with some extremely high level clients there. We're also #1 in China in the automotive sector by a long stretch. If we go to the next page, please, Alan. So the certification services and training that we offer, as I say, are the basic standards mentioned earlier, so the 9, 14, 45001, as well as energy management like 50001, 27001, business continuity, medical devices, which is 13485, and IATF for automotive and aerospace. All of our training services are available both face-to-face or online. Again, obviously, we've had to make all our training online recently due to the pandemic, but we have seen some successful remote training for our clients. Next page, please. Thank you. So nationwide training service for all of our existing clients. So we offer completely free e-learning services for however many employees that you have in your organization that you wish to upskill. So we offer that for free, even if you're not an existing client. It's not really an expensive option, and they are really good courses. In fact, most of the NQA team have taken the courses as part of their induction. We offer in-house training as well. So if you say, let's say you've got 5 to 6 employees in your organization you feel would benefit from a training course, whether it be implementation or internal auditor or right up to a lead auditor level, and then obviously that's something that we can support you with. Public training courses, we run them in hotels across the UK. Again, this has been virtually recently, however, we are getting back to some form of normality. But any further information that you'd like to see on the training courses, they are available on the NQA website. Next page, please. So as I said, that's a real high level overview of NQA. I hope I didn't bore you too much. So as I said, I will now pass you over to Alan, who is our operational resilience professional.
Hi everybody. Yes, thanks very much, Henry. I'm Alan Elwood. I've got 20 years experience in operational resilience and in particular in implementing business continuity systems and in gaining and retaining certification. And our company is also providing third-party certification and audit services for UCAS registered organizations. So hopefully bring some of that experience to bear in this particular webinar, but that's enough for me. So let's get into the meat of what we're here here to discuss. So look, welcome along. Thanks for coming to the seminar. Really good to have you on this webinar with us. Over the next 30 minutes or so, what we're aiming to do is to discuss the core concepts in achieving excellence in business continuity. So that's what the focus is. How do we get that excellence in business continuity that we would argue the new standard is really requiring people to do. So that exploration is going to look at the practical implications of transitioning into ISO 22301-2019, so the most recent version of that ISO. The premise behind this particular webinar is that you are already aware of, or perhaps even more likely had certification to the previous version of the standard. And so we're going to be focusing in on, what it means to make that transition. So this isn't a webinar about what's business continuity about, or a basic introduction or anything like that. So we'll just be cutting to the chase and getting into the bits that are different and why they're different and what you might need to do to resolve any differences in your own systems. Look, if you have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to ask them on the system that's available, so you can input questions via text and we will get those. If at all feasible, I'll answer them during this webinar, but more likely we'll get to them at the end. So we're talking about the transition. There is an NQA transition guide that's available. I'm not going to read that to you. You'll all be glad to hear, and you can do that either during or after this session, because it's available as a download from this session, and it's been attached as a handout for the event. So you can grab hold of that now and download that now if you haven't already done that, and refer to it during the webinar. So this webinar is going to be referencing that transition guide, but then exploring that through my discussion around what that really means. So our focus is going to be on where business continuity systems have been falling down in the past. So that's in our own estimation out of the many myriad of clients that we work with, but also we would say it's reflected in the changes in the current standard that are trying to iron out those issues that have perhaps previously been able to slip through the assessment process for certification. And I would say those areas really focusing on how well business continuity is integrated with the approach to risk, how much planning there has been in terms of the BIA and risk assessment feeding into the plans, and how joined up those plans are across the organization, and the degree to which there's a real capability in place. So the new ISO, we would say, is aiming to cover off those areas particularly, and we're going to be looking at those in detail as we go through this webinar. So here are the objectives for the webinar. You've probably all seen those, so I think they were on the promotional material. And as I said, we'll be drawing on our experience of working with a myriad of organisations from a wide range of sectors, our knowledge of the ISO, but also we'll be leaning heavily on related best practice guidance, such as the Business Continuity Institute's Good Practice Guidelines 2018, in terms of what we're saying. So it's not just our view, it's a view that's held by others as well, but hopefully we'll bring that to life. Okay, no, there's no science behind this in any shape or form. I'm just going to go through the clauses in numerical order. So we're going to start with clause 4, context of the organisation. Look, there's really little change here. I guess the main things to consider within this clause are that any changes that have occurred in the context of the organisation as a result of your experiences of the pandemic, as Henry's just been talking about, they really need to be taken into account when you are thinking about this particular clause and satisfying this for any future audit. So does the contextual assessment of your organisation and its business context and operating environments and all that goes with that, does that adequately reflect and accurately reflect the change in that environment that has resulted from the pandemic? Because there's bound to have been some change either within your own model of operation, or within your staff's expectations, within your supply chain, within what your customers want, or whatever. So have you reflected those changes in the context of the organisation and your view of that? And although the risk appetite statement has been removed, there is nonetheless a need to have a clear relationship drawn between the organisation's view of risk, that is your impact criteria that you're going to use to assess risk, and the threshold levels at which you would deem unacceptable risks or impacts to occur. Those criteria need to be understood, and they need to be integrated with business continuity, or business continuity needs to be integrated with those. that integration really starts here, we would argue, in clause 4 around this contextual piece by having a clear understanding of your approach to risk and appetites and thresholds and the like. But it will also manifest itself into clause 8, operations in the conduct of the BIA and risk assessments, and more on that when we get to clause 8. But this view of risk needs to be very clear and needs to be thought of early on. 4.3 then, the scope of business continuity. Again, although there's no real change here particularly, what we would say is that the scope of the business continuity management system needs to reflect the missions, the goals, the obligations, the business context of the organization. So this isn't just about everyone having a BC plan, and I guess all too often in our own experience, that's what we've come up against. So where the strategic direction provided has been everyone shall have a business continuity plan, with no real particular rationale or reason behind that. There needs to be a clear understanding of what BC is going to protect and why, and it starts again at this point in this understanding of the context of the organization. So really crucial that we get to grips on these few key areas around context. Within leadership then, again, I would say there's no huge change here in terms of what the standard is asking for. There is, however, a requirement, we would argue, to consider carefully how the roles and responsibilities for the business continuity management system, so not just response teams, which are more often well thought through, but the roles and responsibilities around the system perhaps can be less well thought through, that those are properly assigned across, perhaps across the 3 lines of defence, or a model similar to that. And that is not often well done in our experience, and has been detrimental to the governance of business continuity management systems and the reporting and continual improvement approach and everything else that we're going to talk about as we go through the clauses. So what do we really mean by this? Well, not every organisation is going to operate the exact 3 lines, but they may choose to do it differently. But nonetheless, the concepts are probably going to remain pretty standard. So for the first line, really what we're talking about here is it being very clear on responsibilities at the first line. So who owns business continuity? Who's going to identify and implement business continuity or perhaps even wider resilience solutions? Who's going to be on the hook to implement corrective actions that result out of testing and exercising or reviews or real events? And who's responsible for making sure that everything's integrated with risk controls and risk mitigation measures and the like? And really, that's probably going to be departmental management, perhaps departmental BC coordinators, with some form of cross-departmental collaboration function to enable people to share ideas and the like. But being very clear on the first line is important. The second line then really should be about setting the strategy and the objectives, agreeing the policies, the standards, the concepts, the procedures, the guidance. So in other words, setting what good looks like. Assisting the first line through providing professional advice and guidance around BC, designing and owning any continuous improvement programs and processes and the BC activities that feed those, and reporting to senior management, and perhaps even bolstering the third line with subject matter expertise. So we're thinking here about steering groups and perhaps a strategic lead for business continuity, or a BC function, so a permanent function with BC expertise, and a resilience forum or BC forum that's bringing together first and second line to help again share information, share direction, collaboration, and so forth. And then we're into our third line. This is about assurance that the framework is operating effectively, evaluating capabilities and providing assurance reporting, advising on improvements to the framework and the like. And probably that's a responsibility perhaps of audit, internal, external, bolstered by the BC function with some technical and professional expertise. So whether we've got the 3 lines or we're doing it differently, those concepts still remain, the things I've just been talking about, and being very clear on how this is all being done and who's responsible for what is important, and is quite often something that's perhaps given a bit of lip service to. Okay, on to clause 6 then, planning. The only thing here really is this new clause about being clear on how any changes to the business continuity management system are to be managed. And our observation around this is that perhaps the best way to approach this is to integrate change management for your business continuity management system within your existing change management approach. So rather than creating a separate process, we would advocate you integrate that within your existing methods for managing change. Clause 7 then, the awareness, 7.3 awareness changes. Here, really what this is requiring is that the roles and responsibilities are understood as they relate to events before, during, and after a disruption. So that awareness needs to be around what people are doing before. So they need to have an understanding and I guess a competency around everything from conducting BIAs and planning activity to conducting exercises, participating in exercises, training and the like. What they should do during a disruptive event, which is more often been what's been the focus, and then what they need to do after a disruptive event. So sharing lessons after action reviews, identifying how to make improvements, continual improvement activities and the like. So there's a need to make sure that there's awareness around those responsibilities and roles before, during, and after disruption. Okay, Clause 8, this is probably where the meat of the changes are, and where I think they reflect where many systems have perhaps been suffering the biggest detriment in terms of their capacity and capability, if you will. So where the principles have not been applied in the rigor that they otherwise might have done, and the capability that the result is therefore perhaps not as strong as it could otherwise be. Starting with 8.1, operational planning and control, there's no massive change here, but what I would like to point out is that this really is about the degree of understanding, I guess, of what the requirement is here. So this clause relates mainly to the processes and effectiveness of the business continuity management system. So these are processes that are going to meet the BCMS requirements set out in the standard and required to undertake the steps set out by clause 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities to the system. And that understanding requires that clear criteria, such as those for risk that we were talking about, are identified, and that controls, such as for managing risk, management reviews, CAPA, or corrective action, preventative action activities, pardon me, and change management processes, that those are all applied to the business continuity management system. And that needs to cater for suppliers to the system itself that might be relied on for the operation of the BCMS. And they could be different from those suppliers that are relied on for operational delivery of goods and services. That might be different. It's perhaps suppliers that are key to the BCMS, and they may be different. So that's 8.1. Let's have a look now in a bit more detail at 8.2, business impact analysis and risk assessment. And I guess as a summary to this before we get into the detail, I think the main thing here in our observation, and I think what the standard is trying to now resolve, has been a lack of robust and systematic business impact analysis that drives real BC solutions, rather than what has all too often been seen in plans, what we would classify as statements of hope. So this is about driving out real, viable, workable solutions that are going to deliver known outcomes, rather than statements of what you hope might be achieved. So really important that that BIA process is robust and systematic. So this is a lift and copy from 8.2.2 BIA requirements that are set out in the standard. I'm not going to read these to you. You can look at them on the screen and read them yourself, but I'm going to talk about what they mean in a practical sense, what the implications are. So I guess the first thing to say is that business continuity is not about fixing the disruptive incident, and all too often plans seem to be perhaps based on that understanding, but rather business continuity is about reconstituting critical services in a time to avoid unacceptable impacts while the incident is being resolved. So that's an important nuance, but one that will influence our planning approach. To be able to focus our business continuity planning, then, as we've just been discussing, we need clear strategic direction that reflects our business goals and objectives, and that establishes inside of a scope statement the view of the BC capability and the strategy required to deliver that capability. So such direction is going to guide all subordinate analysis and planning. So all the analysis and planning undertaken by client-facing, customer-facing departments and those that support them, such as IT and HR or facilities or whatever, all of that should be focused in on that scope of the business continuity provision. And it also establishes the criteria through which impacts are measured and thresholds of acceptability are judged. So that's back to our understanding of risk that we talked about earlier. And that ensures that we have a uniform approach to analysis and planning. So all too often, planners required to conduct BIAs and build plans have really been left to them to make a judgment call as to what they thought a major financial impact would be, or when they thought the unacceptable level of impact would be reached. Was really what should be happening is a collective view of that defined in the strategic direction that all planners are working towards. Planners then consider that strategic direction to identify their critical processes and activities and assess the impact over time of the total loss, or perhaps an agreed variant of that, of each critical process and activity, and identify any of the resources or interdependencies that those activities and processes rely upon. And through that analysis, BC requirements are derived, and they establish the acceptable level of service required, and that might be less than the full level of service, and it is sometimes known as the minimum business continuity objective, or MBCO, and the time frame within which that level of service has to be achieved, again sometimes referred to as the recovery time objective, or RTO. And the basic principle here is that if you can deliver those BC requirements, so the minimum level of service within that time frame, the recovery time objective, then you will avoid unacceptable impacts to the organization, hence the need to link our continuity planning back to our view of risk. So BC requirements become the objectives of continuity planning. In other words, BC plans deliver those minimum business continuity objectives within their recovery time objectives. To enable that to occur, there needs to be an assessment of the threats to the critical processes and activities, and indeed the resources that might result in a failure, and that could place the capacity to deliver the BC requirements in doubt. So it is that doubt about our ability to deliver the BC requirements that we're looking to understand. How much confidence have we if a threat arises that we can continue to deliver those BC requirements? And if we can't, then we might need to do something about closing that gap. So that includes a risk assessment of the threats to the specific issues relating, or risks relating to those critical critical processes and activities and resources and the like. And that would include suppliers, wider resources, people, technology, and other dependencies, anything that's relied upon to deliver those critical processes and activities. So we're into the granularity here of understanding those specific threats. This is not about solely basing our assessment on wide catch-all statements like the loss of an entire building or the loss of 50% of our staff. They can form useful planning assumptions, but we need to get into the detail of which particular individual member of staff is trained in a particular activity that we rely on, which particular suppliers are we fundamentally dependent upon, and how much risk do they carry, which bits of machinery or equipment are fundamental to what we do, and so forth in terms of these critical processes. So there's a granularity that needs to be got to, and quite often that has been missing in the BIA and risk assessment approach. So ultimately what we're looking to do here is understand for any given process, if a proactive barrier fails, so something that we put in place to stop the threat materializing, if that was to fail, to avoid this kind of non-continuity line of approach where we hit rock bottom and drag along the bottom for an unknown period of time before we claw our way back up to the top again, that we have actually defined the minimum service that must be provided to avoid an unacceptable impact, and the time by which that must be up and available and running, again to avoid an unacceptable impact, and that our planning delivers that and is known to deliver that and can be proven to deliver that because it has addressed all the risks to delivering those requirements, and we've catered for those, we understand them, and we've dealt with them. So that's what we're talking about, the BIA and risk assessment approach, and how that leads into then the next part of the clause 8, the operations, the strategies and the solutions. So I guess sort of emphasizing the point that we've just been making there, that all too often there's been little or no connection between the outcomes of the BIA process and the BC strategies and solutions. These have been two separate things quite often. They're not necessarily very well linked together. So it's really important that any organization satisfies itself that it has workable plans that will help it avoid unacceptable impacts during periods of disruption. You need to be sure you've got those, and those arrangements must clearly set out what is to be done, along with how that is going to be achieved. In other words, by who, when, and with what resources, and what are they going to do to achieve that continuity and deliver the BC requirements. So that level of detail has often been missing in PC plans, with the plans focusing on things like evacuation drills or perhaps more bland statements about the need to recover. And that really isn't, full-blown business continuity. That what we're really after is a true capability, and that resides in our planning as much as it does in the plans. So where you identify that there are gaps in existing arrangements, then we need to close those gaps, and we can take risk-based decisions to do that, which is another reason why we need to link our business continuity approach back to our risks. So it's not just about understanding impacts, but it's also going to help us around decisions about whether we want to close gaps, accept gaps, or whatever based on the impacts that might arise, the cost benefit of closing the gaps and so forth. And all of that will be influenced by our view on risk. Okay, clause 8 again, business continuity plans and procedures. This is really the response plans that are generated to guide the actions of specified teams as they respond, hopefully in a coordinated and coherent manner, to any disruption and focus on delivering the BC requirements we've just been talking about. So how that response is going to integrate with your incident management, crisis communications arrangements, all that needs to be thought through. And those plans need to define what's to be done, who's going to do it, how it's going to be done for things like invocation and roles and responsibilities, notification and call out, triggering, first actions, ongoing BC management, how you manage information, how you take decisions, how you communicate, all of that needs to be thought through, but put in a plan that's usable by people, practical in nature and so forth. 8.5, what I'd like to raise about 8.5 is that really the exercise program needs to validate the totality of the capability over time. So it's not about just repeating the same evacuation drills or disaster site recovery drills or everything else that people might be doing, but it needs to be focusing on the suitability of the plans and solutions and the effectiveness of teams to deliver those such that the BC requirements are met. And we would really consider people to adopt a modular approach of exercising, that over the course of a program, let's say 18 or 24 months in duration, of integrated and joined up exercising will evaluate the capability totally across the whole BC arrangements. And that would include within the partners and supply chains. So modules could include validating the approach to information sharing and decision making, or how our crisis communications, including social media and media engagements, is to occur. How the response is going to be sustained, shifts and welfare provisions, out of hours operations, or managing specific threats such as a ransomware attack, or employing specific solutions, for example, using alternative suppliers. A properly joined up modular approach to exercising over a period of time will demonstrate that all aspects of your capability are going to work for you, and it's something I think really worth thinking about in terms of the exercise program. Okay, again, sticking with the 8.6 is a new clause, evaluation. The focus here really is on evaluating the totality of the planning arrangements and not just the physical documents themselves, which has perhaps, again, all too often been the focus of such evaluation. So the wider approach to evaluation needs to consider the basis of all planning, so the BIAs and risk assessments, do the selected strategies and solutions deliver the BC requirements that have been derived through the BIA and risk assessment processes, including within the supply chain and partners? How have various methods of validation fed into the evaluation process, so the outcomes of tests and exercises and audits and the like? The degree of compliance with the policy in any other direction that's applicable, and how the documents and procedures themselves are updated and continually improved. Of course, that needs to be part of it, but it's not just the only part. Okay, just about to close now. So 2 more slides to go through in terms of the changes. So clause 9, the performance and evaluation. There's not a major change here. I think the point here really is to be clear on the objectives that are set coming out of clause 6 planning for the business continuity management system, and the metrics that are going to be used to measure those, and have a clear vision on how that measurement is going to be conducted and how that informs continual improvement, clause 10. So there needs to be a clear route for all that performance and assurance reporting. And regular reporting against the objectives requires that you have activities to report against, so a maintenance program that is developed and implemented, and that you can also report on maturity, which means that you need to understand the level of maturity, be that in teams or resources or solutions, that was desirable, that you can then measure against and report on. And senior management team need to get the assurance over that activity and over maturity that the reporting that the performance of the system itself is delivering on the overall objective set for it. So last clause then, clause 10, again, very little change here. I guess the main point to note is that we really need to ensure that the outcomes of any management review processes inform the CAPA, corrective action or preventative action process and system, and that itself is used to inform continual improvement. So it's not just about tick boxing around activities undertaken, but it is about closing the loop and learning the lessons from the activities that you've undertaken or from real events and the like. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to move into the questions, opportunity to ask questions. If there are any questions, and there are none yet on the text box that I can see, but if there are any questions, please do feel free to ask them, and I'll do my best to answer those now as we go through the Q&A session. Okay, no questions yet. Oh, there's one question. Okay, let me see what this says. Why is this not called version 2021? Because the current ISO was issued in 2019. It's just there's been a period of time afforded by the certification bodies for you to transition between the previous version and the new version. So the ISO wasn't issued this year, it was issued a number of years ago. It's just that there's been an opportunity to transition between the old standard and the new in terms of your certification. Hopefully that answers the question. Any other questions? So in terms of the audit to the 2019 standard, I think I'm not quite sure what you mean by the trends in that. If you mean issues that need to be worked on, I guess it could be any number of the ones that I've just pointed to, where they may have been dealt with correctly or not, but that would vary across the various clients being audited. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that would be my own observation. So does it stand in line with the BCMS requirements of 27001? The short answer to that is yes. If you've got 22301, then you are covering off any of the requirements for business continuity in 27001. If you've got 27001, you are not necessarily covering off all the requirements of 22301 around wider business continuity. So hopefully that answers that question. So there is as I understand it, somebody's asked about a link download. There is an attachment to this session for you to download the NQA transition guide. So you should be able to you should have been able to access that from the start. And as I understand it, again, NQA are going to make this presentation available as a watch on demand, not necessarily a download, but a watch on demand. So hopefully that answers that. So in terms of, is there a link to a download session? So how important is it to demonstrate the maximum tolerable period of disruption as well as the recovery time objective? Okay, so I think the terminology, I'm going to argue, is neither here nor there. It's the principles really that apply. So if you are carrying out a business impact analysis, you are looking to identify the point at which the failure of a process or activity would induce an unacceptable impact. And you need to identify that point so you can then decide when that particular process or activity needs to be up and running in order to avoid an unacceptable impact. That implies to me that you need to understand what, the maximum tolerable period of disruption, call it what you will, but you need to understand the point at which the unacceptable impact will arise. And then you need to take a decision as to when you're going to have that process up and running again. And that might be a time that's equal to or less than the maximum tolerable period of disruption. And you might call that time the recovery time objective. But again, that's up to you, what you want to call it, I guess. but I think it's important that you do demonstrate understanding and rigor around how you get to identification and deriving those parameters of your recovery requirements. Hopefully that answers that. So is there an expectation of how many strategies and solutions? No, just that the strategies and solutions are linked to, to the strategy should really be linked back to your context and the understanding of what your organization is trying to achieve, for sure, and your business continuity scope, and all that goes around that. And your solutions need to be and plans need to be linked to your and driven and informed by your business impact analysis process. So you can have any number of strategies and solutions. There isn't a set figure, but the important thing is that they just don't sit in isolation, but they are linked back to other sets of analysis that have informed them. There's a basis of planning that underpins your strategies and solutions. I think that's the important piece. So somebody's asked a question here: how does ISO 223 2019 compare with NFPA 1600 2019? I'm not going to answer that question on this call, if that's okay. I put my hands in there and say I'm not a technical expert on NFPA 1600. So, but we could take that offline if that's okay. I'm very happy to discuss that and perhaps find somebody who's a bit more knowledgeable on the NFPA side than me. So know your strengths, they say, and that's not mine. So we have implemented ISO 27001 and complied with A17 very thoroughly. How much effort do we need to have adjust to ISO 2230 newer version? Okay, so in terms of man days effort, so asking for an estimate here in terms of the man days effort required to do that transition, I'm not going to be able to answer that. That would depend on the size of your company and many other parameters in terms of the specific number of man days or hours. What I can say is that ISO 27001 is not about introducing a business continuity management system for the whole organization. There are aspects that deal with business continuity within an information side of things, but ISO 22301 is really about the holistic view of continuity across the entire organization for all of your critical services and products that you produce, and is based on the protection of your client-facing products and services. So these are aligned and similar, but they are different. And I would, as a straw, I guess, and thrown in the air about trying to estimate this, I would say could be considerable amount more effort required to implement a full 22301 approach as opposed to a more focused 27001 approach. Okay, I think that's all the questions so far. So some good questions there. Thank you very much for those. Kept me on my toes. Hopefully I've answered most of those. If there's any that you didn't think you got a decent answer on, you can see my contact details on the slide. Please do get in touch. I'll definitely do my utmost to try and resolve anything that you may have a question on. And if I can't get the answer for you, I'll find somebody who can. So do please let me know. And certainly the question around the other standard, I'll ask somebody directly else within NQA who may be more knowledgeable on that to help feedback on that. So at this point, we've finished our webinar now, unless anybody has any last minute questions. I want to thank you all for getting involved, and I want to wish you all the best for the remainder of the year. And we're running close very shortly into the festive season for many people, in the new year for many people. So I wish you all the best for that, and for any transition period in terms of your ISOs that you may have in front of you. Goodbye.